Are you ready for part 2? Hit it.
3, 2, 1, fire!
Okay, enough of the goofy intro. I've sanded my door. You want to make sure that you're not using too heavy a grit sandpaper. This sanding block is brand new. It's a medium grit. It doesn't give a number. It's probably coarser than 150, I'm not sure. So I did not use it. I used a sanding block I had that was already worn in. And it did a great job. You know, this drywall mud's pretty soft. So you just want to sand down any places that you don't like, get all the rough stubble off. And in a few of the places where I had graining, I sanded, but I also went kind of diagonal on it so that there's a little bit of graining that shows, but it's recessed. And that helps the look a lot. So now I need to blow off the drywall dust and we'll get started on the fun part, the painting. Okie dokie. I will give you a close-up and then we'll start the paint. It's time to mix my paints. And if we take a look at this Barnwood here, you might be able to tell that, not thinking about the white that's on top, we see a mixture of browns, like the original color of the wood as it started to age, and then into the grays as it actually was out in the weather and began to change in color. So the majority of this board is probably, well, it's probably, I would say, a 50-50 mix of browns and grays. So I have 2 containers here that have linen white chalk paint in it. And I have 2 Barnwood stains here. One is a brown and one is a gray. And these are water-based. So it should mix just fine, although it's quite runny. And I can't find my stir stick. I would usually never mix paint with a brush, but these are just cheap chip brushes. They're about ready to throw away anyway. They kind of seen their day. And if you don't know, paint always dries darker than when it is wet. So keep that in mind when you're mixing, because if it looks a little too light, it's going to darken. Now you might be asking me, why aren't you just applying the brown stain and the gray stain directly? Well, they are stains, and I'm really not sure how well they're going to take to a non-painted, non-wood surface. So I'm really needing to add latex paint, in this case chalk paint, in with it. Now, if this is not brown enough, after it dries, I can go back and add the direct stain. So this will be enough just to get us on there. And this is all of the gray I have left. Randy is going to look for some more. Maybe they had it at Lowe's. I can't remember. I either bought it at Lowe's or Hobby Lobby. So if I don't have enough, maybe he'll get lucky and find it at Lowe's. If not, I'll probably have to go to Hobby Lobby again. Oh, that's such a shame. I so hate having to go to Hobby Lobby. Alright, so to begin with, I'm just going to use the brown pretty much with 100% coverage. But where I have this drywall mud, it kind of wants to catch. So I'm just going to let it. I mean, I will be putting some white on the top anyway. But, hey, why cover it up completely when it looks good like that? Okay, now for this gray, which is too light. I'm not going to put a lot of it on because I need the gray to be darker and also kind of blend, since the brown is still laying on here, it's still wet. So you can get a good blend if you keep brushing. Now I used a dry brush to apply this, not a wet brush. That's kind of really important both times. Of course, you know, it was wet with paint because I used the brushes to mix the paint, but they were dry to begin with, and I'm just dabbing just a tiny bit of paint on the end of my brush. I'm going to see if I can scrape out the rest of that gray now and add it on top. I let the paint dry for a little bit, and then I came back out and kind of dry brushed just with the brown barn stain and all of the rest of the gray that I had. And I think we have a pretty good base going here for the next steps, which are going to be a whole lot of fun. But I need to let this completely dry overnight. And then I will show you what we're going to use, what product we're going to use as a relief here and there to pick up the paints that I apply on the top. So there's my Barnwood. We'll get there. Well, it's been 24 hours. I let this door completely dry, the paint on the door dry overnight. And yesterday afternoon, while the paint was drying, we cut the shelves. And looking at the actual board for the shelves, they're much lighter. There's not near as much gray. It's much more just of the tan. So before I start the white paint, I need to lighten overall the whole door. So I'm going to bring you in closer and show you what I'm going to do. Now here were my two paints, my brown and my gray. I'm going to put just a tiny bit of the brown in. About equal parts of the gray. Set these aside here. Paper towel's always good because I'm always getting messy. And I'm going to open my chalk paint and add a touch of it, because even with this mix of the brown and gray, I still think it's going to be too dark. You know, as I mentioned yesterday, paint dries a shade or two darker than it looks wet. Okay, let me grab sample board here, or the shelf. You might be able to see right there, I mixed a little of the brown and the gray together and put it on there. It's already dry. It's too gray. So let's try this. And remember, it's going to dry darker also. I think it might still be a little too much on the gray side. Just a touch too much. Yeah, that's going to be better. All right, now I do not want a very heavy application of thick paint. So I'm going to thin this down with some water. So that it's fairly runny. It'll be thin that way, and it will also dry fast. By the way, I used warm water. And a couple of things I forgot to mention in part 1. So let me adjust the camera and I'll come back and tell you those things. The first thing is that when I was mixing the drywall mud, the Durabond, a special trick to get it to mix really well and smoothly is to use warm, pretty good warm water. And the second thing is, I did ask Randy about whether or not you could apply the drywall mud directly onto a surface that's been where an oil-based product has been used, and he said no. So you definitely have to prime it first with something before you would apply your drywall mud. Okay, so now using a dry chip brush that's pretty ratty actually, I'm just going to lightly dip in my paint and almost just give kind of a whitewash. Not solid. Especially concentrating in the areas where I have a lot of the darker gray, because there's just not much gray on those boards. It's much more tan. I honestly wouldn't say that this was that big of a mistake, because having the various colors on there initially is going to give it a lot of dimension in the end. And I can also do a little bit to the actual shelves if it ends up not matching that well. Be easy enough to do after the shelves are installed. So I'm going to let this dry, and when we come back I'm going to show you the product that we're going to use to create a lift. What will happen is that once we put this down and then we paint over it, it won't bond there, and we'll have paint lifts in the end. It's dry and we are ready to rock and roll with the final coat here. Now let me explain what I'm going to do. I want you to take a look at the shelves. Here's a shelf. Here it is close up. Can you see we have the graining Real tight, showing up here. Most of it has been, the white paint is gone, but there is quite a bit. So there is still some on there. Same with each piece. This one has even a little more white. But that's the look we're going for. Now overall, this is still grayer than this piece. This is much more brown. So I'm still going to be doing full coverage for the most part with the white. But we want to be able to lift some of the white off. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use something that will release the paint, will serve as a barrier between the door and the top paint. That would be petroleum jelly. Now, if I were to just take my fingers with the petroleum jelly and just smear it here and there, I would have big blobs. And this is a tight looking grain. So what I'm going to do is take this old chip brush. Let me zoom you in closer. I'm going to take this old chip brush and really cut it up. All right, we're going to see how that does. I've got quite a few little spaces now. So I'm going to put my petroleum jelly out on a paper plate. I think it'll be easier to distribute onto the brush if I have it on a plate. Okay, now I want to be very deliberate in placement of this petroleum jelly. Where I can see that I have textured grooves will be especially where I want to put some of the petroleum jelly. So I'm just going to lightly coat the brush here, lightly coat it. And run it in spots on the door. Okay, I've got just a little bit of water in this container. I'm going to pour some of my chalk paint in. Now, if this is not white enough, because I've thinned it so much, I can always go back after this initial coat here and add some chalk paint unthinned. But while we're zoomed in, I'm just going to show you just a little bit on the end. And I'm going to start to paint. Now, wherever I have put the Vaseline, like right in here, it's going to serve as a barrier. All right, I'm going to do this over the whole door. And when it is dry, we will come back and I'll show you the next step. I waited about 30 minutes and thought I had the camera on, and I didn't. But I sanded back in really over all of the whole door. And then there were so few areas where it lifted my Durabond product. So I've gone back and touched up and painted that. But I just wanted to show you, here's a couple shells. I added a little bit of more white to the shelves. But I'm going to zoom in. I think we're close enough on color. I mean, it'll serve the purpose that I wanted. So let me zoom in. And I think we're pretty close. So stay tuned for part 3, where we put the baby together. Have a good one.